Hello everyone, thank you for joining today's webinar, Explore and Create with Modo. My name is Elise and I am part of Foundry's industry marketing team, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Andras Kavalecz, who is the CG Supervisor and owner of CheckpointVFX, and my colleague Greg Brown, who is the product owner and designer for Modo. Before we get started today, I just want to go through a quick Foundry update. After that, Andras will present Explore and Create in his work with Modo, and then we will wrap the session with a live Q&A. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask the two of them, please add your questions into the right-hand side of the screen. You'll see a questions tab there, and we will respond to them at the end. Today's event is part of Foundry's Greater Virtual Event Series. We kicked this off in April of 2020 and since have hosted over 60 webinars. You can find all of our webinars on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/thefoundrychannel. Also, we're going to be taking a short break, but we'll be coming back in the middle of July. And if you haven't already, it'd be great to mark your calendar for SIGGRAPH. The dates are August 9th through 13th, and we'll be joining Intel for a special session. And to get $25 off your registration, you can use their code Intel21. Also, if you have any feedback on our virtual events or just want to reach out to the team, you can find us at virtual.events@foundry.com. I'd also like to take this opportunity to mention Foundry Learn. On the Foundry Learn website, you can find tutorials, release notes, documentation, and more from Modo and all of our other products. And then also, I'd like to mention the training that was created by Victor Perez and supported by Netflix is the Color Management Fundamentals and ACES Workflow Nuke. You can find that on our Learn page and also on YouTube. Also, I encourage you to check out our Insights Hub on the Foundry website. Our content team is busy writing case studies and staying up to date with the latest industry trends and bringing articles on a weekly basis, sometimes every other day, it seems like. So if you're interested and you want to have some great content to read, I'd guide you to that page. Also, you can subscribe to our quarterly newsletter if you like what you see. Also, if you are on YouTube and you want to join the Moto Geeks TV, they regularly do a Friday brew o'clock, and you can watch there and subscribe to get notified on when those events will be. And if you're on social media, you can find the Foundry team at either the Foundry team or Foundry team on Facebook, Instagram, your social media channel of choice. And if you're an artist that likes to share their work, we would love to see it. On our social media channels, we love to share user-generated content, and here's a few examples from some artists that have created work that we featured on our Instagram page. So if you are a Modo user, just tag it with Made with Modo, and we would love to check that out. And finally, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today, but also to thank everybody who has joined us here on our virtual stage so far this year. We couldn't do it without you. We really appreciate your support, and we look forward to hosting many more great events. The next portion of the webinar has been pre-recorded for quality streaming purposes, but we are all here live and available to chat. So if you have any questions or want to talk to us, please feel free to ping us in the chat and stick around till the end for the Q&A. So I hope you enjoyed the session and see you on the other side.
Hi, I'm Andras Kavalecz, and I'm the owner of CheckpointVFX here in Burlingame, California. CheckpointVFX is a VFX studio specialized in look development and visual effects for TV series and film, and I'm also the CG Supervisor. Now in this webinar, I want to talk about how I use Modo here at CheckpointVFX. And then I also have prepared a Sizzle Reel, which is a shorter, more compressed version of the CheckpointVFX reel, and then I will be also showing a short movie that was entirely done in Modo. And now, like I said, I want to talk a little bit about my career. So I started creating CGI back in 1989, and the computer back then I used was the Atari 520 ST. Now this computer had a very limited hardware, and it had only a resolution of 320 by 200 pixels. And in this resolution, I could use 16 colors out of 512. So that's not a lot. And all the graphics were done by hand. So all the pixels were set by hand. And to do that, I used the mouse. And back then, I didn't have anything like a Wacom tablet. And the two applications I used back then was Neochrome and Deluxe Paint ST. Both were very similar, and both had similar tools, and both allowed me to choose these 16 colors out of 512. And then they had tools such as a pencil tool to set the pixels, then copy paste, fill bucket, and some basic animation tools. So both software were very limited, but the hardware was limited too. And now these here are two images that I created back in 1994. So that was 27 years ago. And both images were done by hand. So I set all the pixels by hand, and I also did the anti-aliasing by hand. Now the third image here is a screenshot out of a shoot 'em up game that I was working back then. And again, the graphics was done by hand. And so after the Atari 520 ST, I bought a Atari Falcon, and this computer had a far better hardware, and it had a resolution of 640 by 480 pixels, and but it could display 256 colors, and it even had a true color mode. And that was a huge improvement from the Atari 520 ST. Now, after the Falcon, I moved to the PC, and again, I was using Deluxe Paint for the PC. And again, in Deluxe Paint, I was able to use 256 colors, which again was a big jump from coming from the Atari ST with only 16 colors. And so this here is a timeline of my career. So like I said, I started off doing pixel graphics in 1989. Then around 1993, that's when I worked on my first commercial computer games. And I worked on a Atari Jaguar game and also a pinball game for the PC. And I stayed for quite some time in games. And I worked at companies like Sunflowers Entertainment, Electronic Arts in the UK, LucasArts in San Francisco, and also NCSoft. And I held different positions in the games industry. So I started off as a 2D artist, then I became a 3D artist, then I did 3D characters, 3D animation, logo animations, and worked on cinematics. And then I also worked on real-time particle effects for the next generation consoles, such as the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 and 4. And around 2010, that's actually when I moved from games to TV and film. And again, I held different positions. Started off as a CG generalist, doing modeling and texturing, and then later on I became a CG supervisor, and I worked on different TV series and films. And then in 2016, that was the year when I opened CheckpointVFX here in Burlingame, California. And like I said, I started off as a 2D artist, and then around 1996, that's when I saw Lightwave 3D on the PC, and it just got ported from the Amiga to the PC. And so that was also the time when I switched over from being a 2D artist to become a 3D artist. And in 2005, that was the year when I saw the first time Modo 201. And it was very similar to Lightwave, but it had a modern interface, and it had, I saw a big potential in Modo. And so I'm still using Modo here in 2016 and currently using Modo 15. And now this one here, this slide shows just a couple of projects that I worked on, very early on projects in my career, games that I worked on back in 99, and then TV series and a couple of TV series, like I said, and film projects, and I've worked on far more projects, but you can look me up on IMDb or just visit the CheckpointVFX website to read more about the projects that I worked on. Now, I would say I want to show the Sizzle Reel, which again, like I mentioned, is a shorter, more compressed version of the CheckpointVFX reel. It shows quite a wide range of different projects and different styles, and Modo was used in most of these projects. So this was the Sizzle Reel, and now I'm going to show the short movie I was talking about, which was entirely done in Modo. So this was the short, and now I want to talk a little bit about how the spaceship was actually modeled in Modo. Now the spaceship itself comes with like two different challenges. One of the challenges is that it has a very organic shape, and then the other challenge is that it has very highly reflective materials, which can easily show any modeling imperfections like small bumps. And now during look development phase, I'd like to stay flexible as long as possible. And with flexible, I mean I want to be able to do a lot of iterations and a lot of changes very quickly and easily. And now this ship was not modeled the traditional way of like cutting in all the details by hand, but rather I used MeshFusion for that. And MeshFusion is usually used for smaller objects and also a lot of product visualizations you have probably seen. And but it can be also used on so MeshFusion can be also used on larger objects too, of course. And now MeshFusion itself is a real-time live Boolean tool in Modo, which allows you to move around your trim objects, and so you can change your trim objects. You can very easily change basically the details that you want to cut into a surface. And I'm gonna jump into Modo and I'm gonna show the final ship, and then I'm also gonna show how I've modeled in some of the details using MeshFusion. Okay, so this is the spaceship loaded up in Modo 15, and that's the final version of the ship. And it's a little bit hard to see all the detail. And I'm just gonna turn on matte caps. Matte caps are just a material override only for the viewport. If I turn this one on, we can see a little bit better the detail. And then actually Modo comes with a library of matte cap materials, so you can just switch between these materials. So you have like highly reflective materials. And I'm just gonna go down here to this one here, which is called Blue Pearl, which looks more green than blue, but this one here works quite nicely. So again, this is the final ship, and as you can see, it has a lot of detail here, a lot of detail that has been cut in using MeshFusion, and yeah, but you can see that the model is very clean. I don't see any big surface imperfections on it. And now I'm just gonna go in and I'm just gonna switch over to another scene, and I'm gonna show the process of how I'm cutting in all these details. So before I'm gonna talk about MeshFusion, I just want to point out that in Modo you can have multiple scenes open, and then you can also drag and drop a copy paste between these scenes. You can copy paste items, lights, cameras, which is really handy. So there's no need to export and import objects from one scene into another scene. You can just drag and drop them. And okay, so let's have a look at this other scene here, which has the basic hull object, and it's a very simple object, as you can see. It's not much to it, and I'm just going to convert this into a new MeshFusion item, which looks like this, very similar to the base object. And then I'm just going to turn on these trim objects here, and just let's focus on just the first one here, which, as you can see, it's a very simple cylinder shape and some simple rectangles cutting, intersecting with the hull. And the next thing is I'm going to turn this object into a subtractive trim object. That means it will cut in and trim away certain parts of the main hull, and this is the result. And what I can do is I can take the cylinder, for example, move it up a little bit so it doesn't intersect with the hull, and then the result will be that it doesn't contribute to the cut here. And let's just undo this, and then let's just move this down here just to demonstrate. Now you can have a total different look, and then as you can see, the end result of the MeshFusion, or the Boolean operation, looks really nice. I don't see any really big problems here. And let's just undo this. So we go back to the original trim object, and let's focus on the next object here, which is again just a piece here in the middle, and then two smaller cubes also cutting into the hull. I'm just going to convert these also into a subtractive trim. And now let's have a look at this result here. Again, it added these lines here, and then also these rectangle shapes here. And again, it's really clean. And now let's have a look at this one here. These are here the air intakes, and these shapes are quite complex, and I'm just gonna again add them as a subtractive trim. And let's have a look at the result. Again, really clean, and you can imagine that cutting this shape into the hull the traditional way would take quite some time. And the good thing about MeshFusion is, of course, we can just go into these air intakes and move these polygons and reposition them somewhere else. So again, this demonstrates how flexible MeshFusion is, especially for the look development phase. Now let's just undo that again. Okay. Let's have a look at the last object here, which is just a larger piece here. And again, it's going to be a subtractive trim. And this is the final result. So it added really long cut lines here across the entire hull. And again, really clean mesh. I don't see any kinks, any bumps, any errors. And so now you can, I'm just going to jump back into the final ship here, and you can convert the MeshFusion item into a polygonal object, and then if you want you can retopologize or just use this converted polygonal object and just start texturing it, shading it, and then rendering it. And this was actually also how the spaceship was done for this short. And so it was a really straightforward process. And this also concludes my talk about MeshFusion and the spaceship. The next shot I want to talk about is this one here, and that's the underground shot when the staff is being pushed into the soil, and then we see the gravel basically being pushed away, and then we also see the sprouting. Now, before I go into Modo again and show you guys the setup of the gravel, I'm just gonna play this shot again. This shot was initially planned as a practical shot, and this is just a vase filled with gravel, and I'm actually pushing in a metal staff just to observe how much movement we see on the gravel. And now I'm just pulling out the staff just again to observe how much movement we see. Now this shot, like I said, was initially planned as a practical shot, but then it was turned into a fully CG shot, and I will be showing you the setup of the shot. So this is the gravel shot loaded up in Modo 15, and I just want to point out that we have 2,513 individual gravel stones that were actually simulated in this shot. Now I'm just going to show you my setup. So basically there is this simple object here, which is a collision object for the stones. Now what I did is I placed the stones initially up here, and then I applied dynamics to these gravel stones, and then this object here, like I said, has a collision applied to it. So when gravity pulls down these gravel stones, they will collide against this collision object, against the ramp, and then they will roll down, collide against each other, and also collect in this lower area here. And since they're colliding against each other, they won't intersect each other, which was also very important for the second dynamic simulation. And now let's just turn this object off again, and I will just go back into my matcap material. I'm just gonna turn off selection and just turn off the wireframe. I'm just gonna go back into the camera. So what's very important is that there's enough stones, enough gravel stones to fill up that area that the camera sees. And then, of course, like I said, it's very important that they're not intersecting each other. So, and that's also important for the second dynamic animation. And so what's going to happen next is this staff here is also a dynamic animated collision object. And I'm just animating down the staff going through the gravel, and then will collide with the gravel, and then it will push away the gravel stones. And then also the gravel stones are colliding against each other. So now for this simulation, only these stones around the staff were simulated. So none of these stones out here, because they're not moving. And so this is the result here, just quite convincing. So when I go into my camera, I can see it here. And there's a lot of motion going on, like in the reference video that I shot. And yeah, so this was how this shot was actually realized completely in Modo. The last shot that I want to talk about is this one here. That's the landing shot, and this shot is quite complex because it has all the environment in it, it has the ship in it, has particle effects and volumetric effects, everything is animating, so the ship is landing, the camera is moving, so everything had to be timed rather well. And before I go into Modo again, I'm just gonna play this shot again. So I have opened up this shot in Modo 15, and when I scrub the timeline, you see the ship landing. And what I've done is also I've rotated and animated out these side panels so that they actually act as legs for the spaceship to land on. And the front of the spaceship also has two ramps which are rotating down, and then they also colliding with the floor. So this ramp is actually acting as a third leg for the spaceship. And then the last thing that is animated on the ship are these side panels here. And so they're animating out and open up. So that's about for the animation of the spaceship. So when I zoom out, you see that the environment is hidden. So let me just turn the environment on. And the environment is actually just made out of 4 simple planes. And simple, I mean they're really simple. So when I turn on the wireframe, you can see that these planes are just tessellated planes. And all the detail for the environment is actually happening during render time through 2D displacement maps. Now, I can actually also preview these displacement maps in the viewport. But I'm just going to select all 4 planes. I'm just going to set the subdivision level to 8. And I'm just going to reinitialize the viewport. I'll take a second. Here we go. So that's the preview of the 2D displacement maps in the viewport. And again, this is just a preview, so you will see a lot more detail in the final rendered image. Now, what I've also added, I've added the landscape behind the camera and left and right to the spaceship. So we have a panoramic environment for the spaceship, because the spaceship has a very reflective material, so you want to see the environment reflecting in the spaceship. So that's very important. Now, when I zoom in, there are two other things that I want to show. One of them is these replicators. These replicators are actually going to replicate small gravel around the spaceship and close by the camera. And these are gravels in all different shapes and sizes and orientations. So that gives a lot of detail. And you will see the detail here in the camera viewport. So this detail is rather important for the close-up shot here for the ground. And so these gravels are not important for the background here because you will never see them. They're going to be so tiny. And this is also going to help with the render time. Now, let me just turn off these replicators again. I'm just going to go into my perspective viewport, and I'm just going to turn on these high detail stones that I placed around the spaceship. Now let's just jump back into the camera, and you can see that these stones are actually contributing quite a lot to the design of the environment to make the environment more interesting. And I've also placed these stones between the camera and the spaceship, so they are occluding a little bit of the spaceship. So we get a little bit of parallaxing also going on, which is also very important. Now, what's also important is that these stones are arranged in a way that they are also being recognized in the other shots after this shot. So you always know where you are, which means you can always recognize the environment when the pilot is walking around. So, well, that concludes my talk about this shot. Before I'm going to wrap up this webinar, I just want to point out a few plugins that I used for this short. One is ACS2 by Lucas Pacera, which is an auto character setup plugin for Modo. It ships with a biped character rig, which is very robust, fast, and also customizable. And there's also ACS3 on its way, which allows for quadruped rigs. I also highly recommend this plugin. The other plugin that I use is Tropism, and that's a procedural growth plugin inside of Modo, and you can generate trees with it or animate veins. And then I use this plugin for actually the sprouting shots. Now then there's Quad Spinner Gaia, which is an external tool to generate landscapes. And it's a procedural but also artist-driven landscape generator. And then once you are happy with your landscape, you can just export it as a 2D displacement map and then just render it in Modo. So I hope you liked this webinar, and I also hope that I could share some valuable information. And I would say see you in the Q&As.
Wow. Well, thank you very much, Andras. That was a fantastic presentation. You know, it's kind of funny when we ask people to produce these presentations. It's very rare that we get one as quickly as you put it together, which was fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great opportunity, you know.
Oh, cool. No, but it was much appreciated. You had that too. It's like I was like, oh, this is going to take him a month. He's a busy guy, and it was like a week and a half or 2 weeks. You knocked that thing out in, and that takes some serious skill and serious knowledge to pull that off. So. Wonderful, yeah. Wonderful stuff. Before we hop into Q&A and asking some questions, I do want to bring up that we are approaching the release of 15.1, and so that will be in the hands of Modo users soon. We don't want to announce the date just yet, but you will be playing with it soon, and it is in the public beta. If you'd like to play with it, you know, earlier, and you currently are not on maintenance, for instance, for Modo 15. Hopping on maintenance will definitely give you the ability to play with the beta, and we would appreciate any and all feedback. We're doing a good job of refining those features before release. Some of the things that you are going to see in 15.1 that we have already kind of shown in the Brew O'Clock. We'll try and add the link to the Brew O'Clock session where we also interviewed Andras, I believe in March, right? It was March, April. Yeah. We have actually been doing some previews of the features that you're going to see in there. And some of the cool ones, just to quickly jump through them, is curve Booleans, allowing you to cut and intersect one curve with another curve. This is a very narrow pane. I'm having to bring my hands in really close. And the mesh operations stack node, which will allow you now to see order of operations stack relationships directly in the schematic view and how that relates to a node graph. And that is driving some additional features in the future. And OmniHaul, which is our premier feature for 15.1, which will allow you to have gestural control over your tool properties. Like, say, for instance, if you have a bevel and you want to change the number of segments, things of that sort, you'll be able to do that by just dragging in the viewport, and that will come with preset behaviors intact. But then you can also go in and modify that for tool properties. And this also works with any specific channel items as well. So definitely some great enhancements to workflow in that I think will be very impactful. And also updates to MeshFusion and the new deferred and paused evaluation, which as I saw you do the character work that you've done, Andras, I'm very curious how you would be taking advantage of deferred updates. Because, for instance, deferred updates allows you to swap in a proxy mesh in place of your actual animation mesh to maintain interactivity while you're working. And all sorts of other great things too. Continued enhancements to regular Booleans, because Taz is an absolute, he's just an incredible developer, and all of you know what sort of amazing stuff he makes. But 15.1 is shaping up really, really well, and we can't wait to get it in the hands of everyone out there. All right, and I see questions are starting to populate, and as people other than Spreko ask some questions, I'll go ahead and start with some questions that I have in place already. So one of the things I'm really interested about is, Andras, you and I have known each other now for a decade or so, maybe a little bit longer. But I visited you in various studios in California and stuff. You're one of the guys who was always working hard at another studio, but you created your own studio. And as an artist, to me, that's like, oh man, he fulfilled the dream, he fulfilled the fantasy. What prompted you to start your own studio, and what has that experience been like for you?
Well, I think, back in Germany, I also had a studio together with Markus Bader, and so I always liked being a little bit in control of what I'm going to be working on, and which projects I'm going to be working on, what tools I can use, building a pipeline, right? And I also like both being challenged. I like being challenged as an artist, but also the business side of things too. So traditionally, I'm coming with like a business background, so it was always like in the back of my head. But again, like being a generalist, so I like a lot of different things. And I've worked, like I mentioned in the webinar, in the recorded video, that I worked on at many companies and larger companies and stuff, and which is really great. And you learn a lot of things from other people. And but I always felt a little bit like, oh man, I wish I could use this software. I pushed Modo in other studios, to implement it and bring it in, and also other tools, right? So I'm always, I always like the flexibility and the freedom, to bring my own tools and to my work, so I can create the work quicker, right? And so I think having, that came to that conclusion that having an own studio, you're more in control of that, right? So what kind of tools you use, that was very important to me, because in the end, it's like you have an artistic skill, but you also need the right tools to, to convert the art, into something, right? Tangible,
Yeah, so, absolutely. And that's a great segue into, why do you use Moto? Why did you choose to use Moto, especially while starting up a new studio?
Well, the thing is, it's I've been using, like I mentioned, I've been using Modo since 2005, and I in general I like tools which are artist friendly, right? And now other tools are artist friendly too. It just depends on how much time you spend in the tool to learn the tool, right? So while other programs, other software that I used are very technical, I felt that I'm also a technical artist, but not to that extent, right? And I feel Modo does a really good job of taking a lot of things away on the technical side and really lets me focus on the artistic side. You know, so the tools are there, tools are robust, you know, like they're really great tool set, different tool sets, right? And so I feel in Modo I can work more and focus more on the artistic side rather than the technical things, you know. So while you still have like schematic view and expressions and, you know, like Python scripting and everything is available in Modo, right? You necessarily don't need to use it. So the built-in tools are very, very strong, and you know, so it's being constantly improved. And I saw that over the years that, hey, sticking with Modo, you know, like there's an improvement in all these different fields, right? So yeah, I mean, it has, like any other software, it has weaknesses and strengths, right? So, but I feel Modo is excellent, you know, like, so I really enjoy it because it just lets me be an artist and not too much of a technical guy.
Awesome.
And of course, I think one thing is also, you know, it's right smack in the middle of, you know, not being free and not being too expensive. So it's the value, you know, the value that you get from the software, the price value and the features, and then also the unlimited render, you know, render nodes, right, and the built-in renderer, that, you know, empath, and also the traditional render is just like on par with all the other renders out there, you know. So I always comparing, and I was always looking into other software too, just to compare. Hey, am I going to be competitive, right? Is it, because in the end you want to be, if you have your own studio and you go out and you pitch projects, you want to be able to say, hey, I can deliver that quality in that time. So there's sometimes you don't have the ability to say like, hey, I'm just gonna deliver in like 6 months, you know. So you have to start.
Yeah, you never have that choice. It's assigned, right? That's a great point to bring up. I really like the fact that you kind of clarify that. You know, the value that it does offer, in the sense that you think it's production worthy for the things that you do, and within that it brings value. That's fantastic. On that context too, what was your rigging and animation experience like in Modo?
Yeah, well, it's, you know, like I said, Modo is being constantly improved, also on the speed, and, you know, like deformation speed, and, you know, viewport update speed and displacement maps and all that stuff, right? So there's so on this shot, like I mentioned, I used ACS for the rig from Lucas Pachera, and there are other rigs out there too, or you can build your own rig, right? Like schematic and stuff, and you can dive in, you know, make really complex things. But for me, ACS was just like, hey, I have a biped character for that shot, you know, I need something that's quick and easy to set up, right? And also ACS allows, like, to, if you have, for example, like mocap data, you know, you can just bring in the mocap data, apply it to it. So it's very, and FK, IK blending, all the stuff, again, like all the stuff that way back when I was using Lightwave, you know, we were like wondering, how do we do like FK, IK blending? And back then we were using also 3D Studio Max, you know, biped, and they had always like this FK blending in it, and it was fantastic for many, many years. And seeing these kind of features also in Modo, you know, it's just like, it's great, you know. So I feel like any animator would be happy to pick up Modo and animate in it, you know. So I don't see any disadvantages, over, you know, like in to other products, right? So cool. You know, so I think it's all there what you need. You know, it can be always better, you know, but I feel like it's
absolutely,
it's like that's how the entire industry goes. Like everyone is like some software comes up with a great idea, other software is like taking over or being inspired by it and improving on it, so it's like a constant turnaround. So you will never really have the ultimate tool that gives you everything, but you have to find the tool that that allows you to do the most of what you want to do, So.
And I mean, just like any artist, like, oftentimes when I talk to people who aren't 3D artists, I say, well, being a 3D artist is a process of constantly learning. And people who aren't 3D artists are like, oh, yeah, that's the way it is with everything. And I'm like, I don't think it's really as much as it is with being a 3D artist. And now being on the development side of things, it's also very much a part of developing 3D software is, you start out with very novel approaches. Like that's what I think Modo nailed was very novel rigging approaches, like little things like, being able to actually, model on geometry, actually create new geometry on a mesh that's already been skinned to bones, and like the vertex maps populate through to the new geometry and stuff like that. Little things like that make a big difference. And yeah, just to reiterate, Lukasz's ACS3 is looking absolutely amazing. He's incorporating the deferred update stuff to improve interactivity and working closely with Rich Hurry on Ozone, which is an amazing kind of leveraging of order of operations deformation, and doing that, with Modo is going to be very exciting for the future of animation in Modo for sure. All right, and let's see. We've got a few questions, but I'll ask one more before we jump on those. We'll ask those at the end. So in your short, which was beautiful and fantastic, and we can't overstate how much work you put into that.
It was a lot. It was a lot, and it was stretched out, and because there was like projects coming in, and you had to stop, and then again, so.
But you saw it through, and you made a great statement about the philosophy of your studio through an entertaining short. I think that's absolutely awesome. Which shot was the most challenging, and why?
Wow, which was the most challenging? There were so many challenges. There were so many challenges. It's just like every part of it was a challenge, just to be able to, to say, like, to stick to a design, and then, finish up one part, and then, bringing the ship into the landscape, and then refining the landscape, and then you figure out like, oh my God, I wish I would have done something differently, So I think overall it was a challenge. So I can't really pick one certain thing, It's just like it's like there's so many. I think what's a big challenge, and I think it's very important for artists to understand, is going back to the tools that you use, is the longer and the more difficult it is to bring it on screen, your project, right? The more you lose the concept, right? Because you being distracted, like if something takes too long, it's like almost like if you have an idea, the best thing is you take a piece of paper and you have like a little pen and you just make a sketch. It doesn't matter how bad the sketch is, right? But you bring it on paper and you stick to it. This is going to be your design, and you're going to follow through, and you're going to stick with that, right? And I feel like, again, like that's also a challenge to stick with something, and then having the right tool to follow through and discover maybe on the way, like, oh, there's like a little problem that I never thought about it, but I can solve it this way or that way, right? And so, like, again, like I can't really pin one specific shot, because they were all somehow tied into each other, just to. But what I want to mention is also one of the challenge was to come up with a design and come up with a look that is different to the traditional gritty alien space look, So that was also a challenge in itself, So when I talked to Stephen Chang about concept artists that I know, I told him like, hey, Stephen, like, I'm thinking this and this, right? So let's brainstorm about ideas. And my idea was to keep it more like in the 70s style, very, very shiny, very sleek, not so much gritty that we see in all the sci-fi movies, you know, when you turn on Netflix or whatever, you know, like, or any other, you know, show, it has this specific look, which is great and it works, right? But I wanted to do something different, you know. And
your color palette is very 70s, and the shiny spaceship, you know, every time I see a shiny spaceship, I think of Flight of the Navigator, you know, which, by the way, there's an amazing documentary on YouTube on that like was very enlightening for such an impactful movie.
Maybe the one ship that I can see as a close inspiration a little bit is, I don't know which Star Wars movie it is, but it's
Episode 1.
Yeah, when she arrives and she has like this slick, really, you know, simple shaped spaceship, but very shiny, you know, and that it just reminded me.
And it's a hard thing to pull off too, that like highly reflective surface and making it look convincing, because it seems so unnatural. Because, like, you know, you go to a car show with old cars with chrome bumpers, it's like the effort put into making that chrome shine makes it look actually unnatural, and it's you really pull that off well. All right, so let's just jump into some of the questions from viewers. And so Sreko, his first question was, what was Moto performance like when working with a project like this?
Of course, it depends on your machine, right? So hardware, you know, like if you have like a, you know, a super beefy graphics card, then you're gonna have a fast experience, right? So, but in general, it was good. And but of course, you have to, like in any other package, you know, you have to know, you know, you have to organize your project in a way that you can turn things off and on, you know. So again, it comes to the point where the more streamlined the software is, the more you know how to cut corners, right? So you know, but in general, I would say like the performance was, I think the project was started with version 13, I think, and then 14 and then 15. So it was like always like updated, right? So I could see improvements, you know, and I'm like, oh, okay, you know, that got better, you know, that got better. So
that's interesting, because since it's your studio, you're able to update to the latest version and then continue using it. And so oftentimes people don't see that direct correlation version to version on a single project. So that's
so that's also coming back to the question of you know, working in a big company, which has its benefits, but also is you know, with limitations, is updating software, right? So you could be stuck, you know, with the software, depending on how long the project is, right? You could be
the next version could solve every problem you have, but you're not allowed to use it. Exactly. Right? Which is important for the pipeline, but
you can't update, right?
Yep.
So, but as I can dictate on a far smaller level, you know, than bigger studios, but I can just make sure that the software can be updated to just benefit the updates.
Gotcha. Did you leverage referencing or proxies at all to improve performance?
Well, the things, the stones, the larger stones, they have proxies. So I bring them in, you know, as needed, because sometimes it's just like you don't need to see them, you know, like in its flow, you know, full glory over, you know. So, but that was, and also the ship was actually referenced in. So the ship was referenced in. So there's a master scene of the ship, and then being referenced in, and so I could just update. But I mean, I was planning ahead, or potentially having the ability to update, and it would propagate to all the other shots, you know. So, but since it was since the first focus was the ship, you know, it was pretty much done. So then it became, but some of the shots I had to bring in certain things, and then then the Modo scene actually became like 1.7 gigabyte.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, exactly. But it's good to see that you're using our referencing and using that successfully, and leveraging proxies, of course. And again, 15.1 with the deferred updates, that's going to improve your procedural modeling experience. But, you know, combining that alongside use of proxies for static elements and things of that sort should really have a big impact on interactivity inside of Modo. And John Bavaresco asked, what render engine did you use? And do you have a preference
Okay. So so initially, like when the project started, it was like there was no NPath, so it was the traditional render engine. So I stuck with the traditional render engine. I did tests with MPath, just to get like comparisons and see like which where could I benefit using MPath. But the majority of the shop was actually done with the traditional Modo renderer. So but since Alan is and the team is like improving MPath, so there's a way of like, the next hint, the the sequel to it, might will use MPath, so
cool.
Yeah,
and we'll keep on working on it. As you know what's going on behind the scenes there. Another one to mention for 15.1 is we added support for dispersion, which as light refracts through a surface, sometimes it's split apart or refracts differently based on the color, and you end up with that kind of rainbow effect, and it's a very natural effect. We've added support for that, and it has a minimal effect on render time. It really adds to the realism, and so one of the nice things we'll see with MPath and the next update. John also had an addition to that question, which is, did you rely on a render farm service at all, or did you do this all on your own?
Everything in-house.
Wow.
Everything.
Okay.
I mean, there are render farms out there which support Modo, and I use them, and they're very. I don't want to make any mention specific ones, but they're out there. And so if you are in need of a larger render farm, you can just go and book some time on a cloud render farm. So that's. And again, that comes down to it's also I think even if you find a render farm which suits you the best, I think you can convince them to invest into Modo, the render farm, because they just basically, they get like one license and they can easily deploy, right?
Yeah, it's very straightforward for them, yeah.
But it's also in-house, like if you have like more machines or whatever, you just plug them in and that, hey, you have your deadline or whatever, right?
Exactly.
Find your new nodes and that's it, so.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Let's get this one last question in here. I might miss yours, Jawad. We'll see how we do here. But Tarjay asked or said that you do awesome work. And what are your 2 favorite or most used features in Modo? And what is 2 things you would like to see in the future?
Oh, I see. Okay. The 2, oh man, it's really changing from like 13 to 14.
Point release to point release, even.
Yeah, which is now my favorite feature. I think favorite feature is still, I feel, man, there's so many. But I would say the simplicity of and the ease of polygonal modeling in Modo. Just a way of like, you're really close to the like it's the tools are made in a way that you're really close to the object that you want to model, right? And not being forced of using this and going out of this mode, going into that mode, so you're very close to the model. So I like that fact, so that you can, and this ease of modeling, right, flows into things like UVing, right, which is also very important and underrated, like by many artists and stuff. But it's a very important thing too, to have the right tools, to check overlapping, to check stretching and all that. So there were like a few spaceship projects, that really required super accurate UVing in Modo, right? Like, and across like 90 UDIMs and stuff. So
there you go. Gotcha.
So like just to have them features like to show like texel density or texel, stretching and stuff, and copy UV scale from one object to the other. There's so many things to it, and then of course the whole rendering aspect. Like I'm a big
built-in renderer. Yeah,
the built-in renderer, and also I'm still sticking a lot to the layered-based, shader-based. Like Photoshop style, like way, because I'm doing all the compositing stuff with like node based and stuff like that. But sometimes there's no need to make it overcomplicated, right? So, and everyone knows like, hey, I'm gonna have like procedural node over it, right? And then I have a mask, and that's it. So there's no like, oh, I need to like convert this into a UV ramp, and then rethinking that, and which node was that, and all the nodes are coming from different applications. They name them differently. They have a little bit of a different approach. So having a very simplified approach in Modo, again, with the shader tree, lets you very quickly generate, like prototype shaders and test things out. And if you want to make it more complicated, you can go into like shader, like schematic view and hook up some other stuff, But if you don't need to, then stick with what's the easiest,
And the granularity of what a group item offers you versus the decoupling of a material from a shader item, and how that offers you a lot of granularity. And one of my favorite things is the local versus global arrangement. That's easy to set up in a tree-based view, where I can cast dust over an entire scene, including all the characters, and it all matches. Stuff like that. It's really cool.
Or you just put over, if you just want to generate like a render pass, like for dust, you want all the characters to be black or whatever color. Just put like a shader on top of the entire stack, and it will overwrite and make all the materials black or whatever, or give them another specific, look, for say. And then you just have a new render layer. So it's very, I think it has to me, still, it has more benefits than drawbacks or like limitations.
I prefer stack-based views over node-based views for creating materials. Compositing, I think node-based actually works out a little better. These are all preferences. But I completely hear you there. And we are actively discussing about ways that we can improve readability of the shader tree, so these are things that are on the short list of some of our improvements. And I'm going to sneak in, even though we're a little bit over time, but a real quick final question, and I'm going to paraphrase. Did you use multi-res on the flat planes on the background, or did you use displacement maps?
That was just the displacement map.
Just displacement maps.
Just on the shader, just like a standard subdivision object with the displacement map. And what I did is, in the video, I'm explaining that I'm actually, in the viewport, you can set the subdivision level from 2 to 8. So you have a subdivision level in the viewport, a higher subdivision level. So Modo is more accurately displaying or previewing the displacement map.
Or a separate render setting, so that you don't have to have 80 million polys in your viewport. But get them in the render.
So it's just like, like for these, for animating certain things, you not always need to have like all the detail anyway. You just need like reference points and stuff, so where you're looking at, where the character is going to be walking, so
exactly.
So
very cool.
Don't make it too complicated, people. Make it, streamline your work and make it.
Why do I feel like you're like talking directly at me? I think probably anybody watching this feels like you're saying that directly at them. No. It's one of these things, like I hear that, I'm like, maybe I overcomplicate my artwork, maybe, but I hear you there. It's
very easy that people just like think like overthinking it, just focus on the stuff that you want to do and make it.
Exactly. Well, we're going to have to wrap this up now. Elise has been very patient with us, going a little bit over time. Thank you very much, Elise. And it was a pleasure seeing your work, your presentation, your short. Everything is just fantastic. And, I just want to emphasize how much I continue to admire the work that you do, Andras. It's incredible stuff. And, looking forward to seeing the next things you do. And to those who are watching this, definitely catch us on the Brew O'Clock. There is an earlier Brew O'Clock featuring Andras as well, and this project that he worked on. And over the next coming weeks, our Brew O'Clocks will be talking a little bit more about the things you will see in 15.1. Shane, when Shane has a brew, he seems to be a little bit more willing to divulge information. So it's a good one to jump into if you want to catch some early information. It depends upon the day, right? Okay, so thanks again. Have a great time, everyone, and really appreciate your presentation and all those who are viewing this. See you guys later.
See you guys.
Have a great day.